The laughter started before Preye even finished her sentence. 12 executives sat around a glass table on the 40th floor of a Victoria Island tower, and every single one of them turned to look at her the way people look at something that had wandered into the wrong room. She had said only 4 words: the community needs closure. And already Bankole Adisa was smiling behind his hand. Already someone was whispering. Already the air in that cold, glass-walled room had changed. Nobody in that boardroom knew that the speech, which had just earned their company a standing ovation from the Minister of Petroleum 3 days earlier, had been written word for word, comma for comma, by the same woman they were now laughing at. If you love Nigerian folk tales that pull you in and refuse to let go until the very last sentence, stay close and consider subscribing, because what happened in that boardroom was only the beginning of a story that started on a river 18 years earlier with a woman who was forbidden to ever speak for herself. Preye Ockiya had grown up in a settlement so small that it did not appear on most maps, a cluster of stilt houses along a tributary of the Non River, where the water was the color of tea and the air always smelt of wood smoke, dried catfish, and the sweet rot of mangrove. Her grandmother, a woman named Ibitoru, was the most quietly powerful person Preye had ever known, and yet Ibitoru almost never spoke for herself. When a fisherman's wife wanted to convince her husband to send their daughter to school instead of marrying her off at 15, she went to Ibitoru. When 2 families feuded over a stretch of creek and the elders could not settle it, they sent for Ibitoru. She would sit, listen, and then speak, and somehow the words she chose would land in a person's chest like a hook finding a fish, gentle but impossible to shake loose. People called her Iya Life, the mother of words, though never to her face, because she disliked the title. "Words are not mine," she told young Preye once, mending a net by lamplight. "The river gave them to me. And one day, if it chooses you, it will take them from me and give them to you. And when that day comes, granddaughter, you must never, ever use them for yourself." Preye had laughed at that as a child. She was 11, restless, more interested in catching mudskippers than in old river stories. But there was one rule in the family that even the youngest children obeyed without question. Nobody imitated Mama Ibitoru's speaking voice, not even in play, because the last person who had done so, a distant cousin decades earlier, had reportedly lost his own voice for an entire rainy season, waking one morning simply unable to make a sound. Whether that story was true or exaggeration passed down through generations, nobody in the settlement wanted to test it. The gift, as the elders explained it in fragments over the years, was not magic in the way outsiders imagined magic. It did not summon spirits or part water. It was subtler and in some ways heavier than that. Whoever carried it could speak a truth so clearly, so honestly, that it reached people beneath their pride, beneath their fear, beneath whatever wall they had built around their hearts. But the gift came bound to an old agreement, older than anyone living. The carrier could never use those words to serve her own wants. She could speak for a village, for a family, for a stranger drowning in grief, but never, ever for herself. The moment she did, the river would begin slowly to take the gift back. Preye did not think much about any of this until she was 17, and an oil company came to drill near her settlement, promising boreholes, a new clinic, and scholarships for children who qualified. Her results were good enough, and so she was sent, alone, to a boarding school in Warri and later to university in Lagos, carrying little more than 2 wrappers, a duffel bag, and an accent that rolled and dipped in a way the city did not recognize as beautiful. The mockery began almost immediately, and it never really stopped. In her first week of university, a lecturer asked her to read a passage aloud, and by the 3rd sentence, laughter rippled through the hall. Not cruel laughter exactly, the kind that told itself it was harmless, but laughter all the same. aimed at the way she pronounced her R's, the music underneath her English that marked her as someone from the creeks and not from the city. A roommate mimicked her behind her back, thinking Preye had already left the room, not knowing she had come back for a forgotten umbrella and had heard every syllable. She said nothing. She simply stood in the doorway until the roommate noticed her, and then she turned and walked back out into the rain without the umbrella, because she would rather be soaked than give anyone the satisfaction of watching her flinch. She learned quickly to speak less. She learned to write instead. And it turned out that she had, without ever choosing it, inherited more from her grandmother than she realized. Because whatever she wrote, assignments, essays, later cover letters and reports, carried something that made people stop and read it twice. A lecturer once kept her after class, not to scold her, but to ask, almost suspiciously, whether she had copied her essay from somewhere, because a teen-year-old did not usually write with that kind of quiet, unsettling honesty. She had not copied it. She had simply, for the first time in weeks, allowed herself to write the way her grandmother spoke. And the moment she noticed the effect it had, she felt a small, cold fear, as though she had accidentally lit a lamp in a room she had been told to keep dark. She did not think of it as a gift. She thought of it as the only armor she had left. By the time she was 26, Preye was working as an executive assistant at Solendra Energy, a mid-sized Nigerian oil and gas company with offices in that glass tower in Victoria Island, the same kind of company that had once put a borehole and a scholarship scheme in her home settlement. And though she did not yet know the full shape of this, the very company whose drilling operations near the Nun River had begun 3 years earlier to poison the same water that had once given her grandmother the gift. Her official job title was Executive Assistant to the Managing Director, Mr. Ifyong Bassi, a broad-shouldered Efik man with silver at his temples and a reputation for giving speeches that made investors weep and journalists forget their prepared questions. What almost nobody at Solendra knew was that Mr. Bassi had not written a single one of those speeches in 4 years. He would call Preye into his office late at night, describe roughly what he needed to say, and by morning she would hand him 3 typed pages that when he read them aloud the next day would leave rooms in complete stunned silence before they erupted into applause. She never asked for credit. She told herself this was simply how the corporate world worked, that ghostwriting was normal, that everyone did it. Once, early on in Mr. Bassi's office, she had gently mentioned that perhaps her name could appear somewhere, even quietly, as a contributing writer on the company's internal newsletter profile of him. He had laughed, not unkindly, and told her that the magic only works if people believe it's coming from me. And she had laughed along with him, because agreeing was easier than arguing, and because the salary, small as it was still more than her family back home had ever seen in one place. But some nights, walking home past the estuary bridge with the city lights bleeding orange across the water, she thought of her grandmother's warning and wondered, with a small cold feeling in her stomach, whether she was breaking the old rule after all. Not because she was speaking for herself, but because she was pouring the only true voice she had into another man's mouth and calling it survival. There were smaller cruelties too, the kind that left no mark anyone else could see. In meetings, Mr. Bassi would sometimes read her sentences aloud to the board with theatrical flourish, pausing for effect exactly where she had built the pause into the rhythm of the writing, and afterwards accept compliment on his way with words, while she sat 2 seats away, taking notes, invisible. She began to notice that the less she spoke aloud in that building, the more valuable her silent, written voice seemed to become to everyone around her, as though the 2 things, her spoken self and her written self, were being quietly, deliberately kept apart, and only one of them was ever allowed into the light. 3 months before that boardroom morning, everything changed. A joint of Solendra's pipeline near the Nun River ruptured during the rainy season, and crude oil spread across nearly 9 kilometers of creek and mangrove, killing fish, poisoning drinking water,
And though the company's early statement avoided saying so directly, very likely reaching the exact stretch of water where Preye had grown up. She did not sleep that night. She called her uncle, and what he told her broke something loose in her chest that she had spent years keeping carefully tied down. Her grandmother, Ibitoro, had died 2 years earlier, not as the family had gently told Preye at the time over a crackling phone line of old age and a tired heart, but her uncle now admitted to something closer to grief and shame. Years before the spill Preye now saw on video, an earlier, smaller leak had happened, and a company, this same company, though under a different name back then, approached Ibitori directly. They had heard of her gift to the way rumors travel along waterways faster than roads. They asked her, gently, respectfully, to speak to the community, to help everyone accept a modest compensation and move on quietly. No lawyers, no press. And because Ibitoru trusted that her words were meant to heal, not to manipulate, she agreed, believing she was easing suffering, calming fear, restoring peace to a community in shock. It was only afterwards, when the compensation turned out to be a fraction of what the damage deserved, and the company quietly resumed drilling with almost no changes to their practices, that Ibitoro understood what she had actually done. She had used the river's own gift unknowingly to pacify her people into accepting harm against themselves. The guilt of it, her uncle said, sat on her like a stone she never put down. She stopped speaking for anyone after that, even for small village disputes, and something in her seemed to dim year after year, until her heart simply gave out one quiet morning while she was mending a net, alone. Preye sat with the phone in her hand long after the call ended, and for the first time, she understood the true shape of the old warning. It had never really been, never speak for yourself. That was the surface of it. The deeper truth, the one her grandmother perhaps only fully understood at the very end of her life, was this. The gift was dangerous not because it could be used selfishly, but because it could be borrowed by people with power and turned into a weapon against the very people it was meant to protect. 2 days later, Mr. Bassi called her into his office, visibly shaken, a rare crack in his usually polished calm. The spill had made international news. Investors were nervous. A parliamentary committee was asking questions. He needed, he said, a something extraordinary, a speech for a press conference that would reassure the public, calm the market, and, in his words, put this whole unfortunate incident in its proper context. He wanted it by morning. He did not ask if she had any connection to the Noon River. He did not know because in 4 years he had never once asked where she was from. That night, sitting at her small kitchen table with the ceiling fan clicking overhead, Preye stared at a blank document for almost 3 hours. She thought about her grandmother, mending nets and swallowing guilt until it stopped her heart. She thought about the black water sliding under the stilt houses of her childhood. And then, slowly, she began to type. Not the speech Mr. Bassi wanted, not yet, but something else. A document she would keep for herself, a letter she was not sure she would ever send to no one and everyone, in which she finally, for the first time in her adult life, wrote in her own true voice without translating it into something more palatable for other people's ears. In the morning, exhausted, she handed Mr. Bassi his speech. It was polished, moving, carefully worded to acknowledge concern for affected communities while promising nothing specific, and it was, without question, brilliant. The kind of speech that made a room of skeptical journalists soften themselves. When he delivered it 2 days later, the clip went mildly viral for the right reasons, praised as a rare example of a Nigerian company taking responsibility with dignity. The Minister of Petroleum personally shook Mr. Bassi's hand afterwards. Nobody in that room, watching him speak with such conviction, knew that the words moving them so deeply had been shaped by a granddaughter of the exact river they were pretending to have already made peace with. Before I tell you what happened in that boardroom afterwards, if this story has already pulled you in, go ahead and subscribe now, because you do not want to miss what happened next. The truth that came out shocked people far beyond that glass-walled room, and it changed the course of Preye's entire life. The trouble began 3 days after that press conference, when Solendra's board decided they needed a follow-up strategy session to discuss what they called community sentiment management ahead of a planned visit by international auditors. Mr. Bassi, riding high on the praise from his speech, made an offhand decision that would unravel everything. He asked Preye to sit in and present a brief outline of ideas for the community outreach messaging, since, as he put it in front of the entire board, she has a good instinct for these things.
It should have been a quiet, procedural 5 minutes. Instead, the moment Preye stood, notes in hand, and began to speak in her own voice, not the borrowed cadences of the boardroom, but her real voice with its Ijaw rhythm still calling underneath every sentence, she watched the room shift the way it always shifted. A junior director glanced at another and smirked. Bankole Adisa, the youngest board member and famous within the company for his imported vocabulary and his habit of correcting other people's grammar in meetings, actually laughed out loud, a short, sharp sound he did not bother to disguise, and said, loud enough for the whole table to hear, Sorry, please continue. I just want to make sure I am following your interesting pronunciation." Preye felt the old familiar heat rise up her neck, the same heat from that lecture hall 8 years earlier. She saw Mr. Bassi, the man whose award-winning speech she had written 48 hours earlier, glance down at his phone instead of defending her, and something in that small, cowardly gesture told her everything she needed to know about where she truly stood in that building. She did not finish her presentation that day. She excused herself, walked to the ladies' restroom on the 40th floor, locked herself in a stall, and cried the kind of tears that come up from somewhere much older than the insult that triggered them. And it was there, sitting on the closed toilet lid in a designer restroom overlooking Lagos Lagoon, that her phone buzzed with a message from Adaora Kalio, one of the company's junior legal officers, someone Preye barely knew beyond polite greetings in the hallway. The message contained a forwarded email chain, and as Preye read it, her hands began to shake. In the thread, dated 11 months earlier, Mr. Bassi had written to the head of communications, "Use EA Ockiya for the community-facing drafts going forward. Her writing has a tone that lands differently with these audiences, more authentic. Keep this arrangement informal. No need to credit her publicly. It works better coming from me." Adaora's note beneath it was simple. "I think you should see this. I'm sorry. I don't think what they are doing to you today is separate from this." The company had known all along exactly what her voice was worth. They had simply decided it was worth hidden than heard. That night, Preye did not go home. She took an overnight bus east, toward the delta, toward the river, arriving at her settlement just as the sun was rising orange and low over the mangroves, the water still faintly rainbowed with an oily sheen that made her stomach twist. Her uncle met her at the jetty, surprised, worried, and together they walked to the small cemetery behind the settlement where Iboturu was buried beneath a simple wooden marker already softened and greened by 2 rainy seasons. She sat by the grave for a long time until the smell of frying akara drifted over from a neighboring compound and someone's radio crackled with a high-life tune 3 doors down. Ordinary sounds that felt almost obscene against the size of what she was carrying. Children she did not recognize ran past chasing a half-flat football, and one of them, a small girl with beads threaded into her hair, stopped to stare at Preye's city clothes before an older sibling pulled her away, whispering. It struck Preye that she had become, in her own village, a curiosity, a person shaped by somewhere else. She was still sitting with that thought when an old woman she recognized as Iboturu's closest friend, a fisherwoman named Sokonye, came and sat beside her without a word. It was Sokonye who finally told Preye the last piece of the story, the piece even her uncle had not known. Iboturu had chosen in her final year to try to pass on the gift properly,
formally, the way it was supposed to be done, through a river blessing ceremony at the mouth of the creek during the dry season. But the ceremony had gone wrong, not because the river refused Preye. Sokonye was certain, watching it, that the river had indeed chosen her, but because Iboturu, still carrying the unspoken guilt of what she had done for the company years earlier, had been too broken to complete the ritual with a clean heart. The gift had passed to Preye anyway, but incomplete, unstable, unclaimed, which was, Sokonye said gently, exactly why Preye had spent her whole adult life pouring her true voice into other people's mouths instead of her own. The gift had been waiting, all this time, for her to finish what her grandmother could not. There is one more thing, Sokonye said, and here her voice dropped low, careful, the way people speak when they are about to hand you something heavy. The old warning that you must never speak for yourself, your grandmother did not believe that in the end. She told me, the week before she died, that the elders who first taught her that rule, generations ago, had shaped it that way on purpose, so that whoever carried the gift would always be useful to others and never dangerous to power. A voice that only ever speaks for someone else, she said, can never threaten the people sitting comfortably above everyone else. She wanted me to tell you, if you ever came looking, that the river does not punish a woman for speaking her own truth. It only punishes a voice used to deceive. That is the real rule. Everything else was fear, wearing the river's name. Preye sat with that for a long time as the morning mist lifted off the water. Somewhere downstream, children were laughing, splashing in a stretch of creek that, mercifully, the oil had not yet reached. She thought of her grandmother, mending nets in silence for 2 years, carrying a guilt that never needed to crush her if only someone had told her the truth in time. And she thought of the boardroom, of Bankole's laughter, of Mr. Basi's careful, cowardly silence, of an email that reduced her entire voice to a useful, unpaid, uncredited tool. That night, Preye returned to Lagos 4 days later with a decision already forming, though she told no one what it was. The international auditors were scheduled to visit Solendra's headquarters exactly 1 week after her return, and Mr. Basi, apparently unbothered by the incident in the boardroom, or perhaps simply confident that Preye needed her salary too much to make trouble, asked her to prepare final community messaging for a live-streamed town hall meeting that would be broadcast to shareholders, journalists, and crucially, though the company did not seem to have thought this through, to a community liaison screen set up in her own home settlement so that affected families could watch and theoretically ask questions. He wanted, once again, reassurance without responsibility, comfort without change. He wanted, in other words, exactly the kind of speech that once broke his grandmother's heart quietly, alone, until it stopped.
This time, Preye wrote 2 speeches. The first, the one she handed to Mr. Basi the night before the town hall, was smooth and careful and said almost nothing at all, precisely as instructed. The second she kept folded in the inner pocket of her blazer, written in her own hand, in her own true voice, the one with the river still curling underneath every syllable. The town hall was held in the same glass-walled room where she had been laughed at 11 days earlier, except now cameras lined the back wall and a large screen beside the main table showed, in a smaller box, faces from her own settlement, her uncle among them, Sokonye seated near the front, dozens of neighbors crowded onto benches around a single borrowed television. The morning of the town hall, Lagos traffic crawled thick and slow along the bridge, and Preye sat in the back of a company car with the second folded speech pressed flat against her ribs beneath her blazer, as though it might be discovered if she did not keep it hidden close to her skin. Her phone buzzed once with a message from her uncle, just 3 words, sent from a borrowed handset at the settlement viewing point. "We are watching." She typed nothing back. She was not sure her hands were steady enough yet to type.
Inside the boardroom, technicians taped cables along the floor and adjusted the large screen showing the community feed, testing the audio twice, 3 times, until Preye could hear faintly the murmur of her own settlement leaking through the speakers. Someone coughing, a plastic chair scraping against wood, a baby fussing somewhere near the back of the crowd gathered around that borrowed television. Bankole arrived 7 minutes late, straightening his tie, offering the room a general, confident smile that did not once land on Preye. Mr. Bassi arrived last, freshly barbered, radiating the particular calm of a man who believed the hardest part of the crisis was already behind him. Mr. Bassi stood first, delivered Preye's careful, hollow words with his usual polish, and the room responded the way rooms always responded to him, nodding, softening, ready to move on. On the small screen, Preye watched her uncle's face stay perfectly still, unconvinced, the same expression he wore whenever a trader tried to overcharge him at the market. Then, as planned, Mr. Bassi turned and introduced her, this time with slightly more generosity than before, gesturing for her to share a few operational notes on the community engagement timeline. Preye stood. She felt Bankole shift in his seat, already anticipating something to smirk at. She felt Mr. Bassi's polite, expectant smile, waiting for 5 harmless minutes of scheduling details. And on the small screen to her left, she saw her uncle lean forward and Sokonye go very still, as though the old woman somehow already knew what was coming. Preye did not open with operational notes. She opened by saying her own name in full, the way it was given to her at birth, Tamuno-Preye Ockiya. And then she said, quietly but clearly, that she was not simply an executive assistant standing before them, but a granddaughter of the Non River, raised in one of the very settlements now shown flickering on the screen beside her, and that every word the managing director had spoken at the earlier press conference, the words that had earned him a handshake from the Minister of Petroleum, had in fact been written by her, in the same kitchen where she now sat each night, wondering whether the water reaching her family's stilt house was safe enough to boil for tea. The room went utterly silent, the particular silence of people recalculating everything they thought they understood in the space of a single sentence. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She told them in her own accent, unhidden and unapologized for, that a woman named Ibitoru had once been asked, gently and respectfully, by a company much like this one, to calm her people into accepting less than they deserved, and she had spent the rest of her life quietly breaking under the weight of what she had unknowingly done. She told them that she herself had almost repeated that exact mistake 11 days ago, until laughter in that very room had strangely cracked something open in her that needed cracking. She said that the community on the screen beside her did not need reassurance. They needed the pipeline repaired properly rather than patched. They needed independent water testing, not vague promises. They needed the company to say plainly, on camera, what actually happened, instead of paying a woman quietly, informally, without credit, to make the truth sound softer than it was. Bankole opened his mouth once as if to interrupt, to correct, to mock, and then closed it again, because there was for the first time since Preye had known him, absolutely nothing clever left to say. On the small screen, her uncle had both hands pressed over his mouth. Sokonye was not at all astonished. She was smiling, the particular smile of someone watching a debt finally being paid. Mr. Bassi stood frozen at the head of the table, his earlier polish gone, his face moving rapidly through several expressions, anger, panic, and beneath both, something that looked almost like shame, because every journalist in that room now understood in real time that the celebrated speech from 11 days ago belonged to someone he had deliberately kept invisible. Preye finished, not with an accusation, but with a simple, steady sentence that would within hours be clipped and shared across every major Nigerian news platform. You laughed at my English 11 days ago in this same room. You did not know that English had already convinced a government minister to shake this man's hand. Today, I am not asking you to laugh or to applaud. I am asking you to finally listen, not to how I sound, but to what my people and my grandmother's memory deserve. She sat down. For nearly 4 full seconds, nobody in the boardroom moved.
The fallout was immediate and in some ways larger than Preye had ever intended. Clips of the moment spread quickly online, not because of outrage alone, but because of something rarer, genuine, widespread recognition, the particular ache of an entire country that had spent generations being told their accents made them sound less intelligent, less capable, less worthy of a seat at the table. Suddenly watching a young woman dismantle that lie in real time using nothing but the truth and her own unhidden voice. Within a week, the auditor's report forced Solandra's board to commit publicly to a full pipeline overhaul and independent water testing near her settlement, terms far more binding than anything the earlier quiet speech had promised. Mr. Bassi resigned within the month, framed publicly as stepping down to allow fresh leadership, though everyone who had watched the footage understood the truer, less generous reason. Bankole, notably, never mocked anyone's accent in a Solandra meeting again, and colleagues later said, half joking, that he had become almost painfully polite whenever a Niger Delta accent entered a room. Preye did not stay at Solandra. She was offered within weeks 3 separate positions from rival companies, eager to associate themselves with the now famous boardroom speech, each one dangling a generous salary and a shinier title. And one recruiter, awkwardly, even asked whether she would be willing to keep the accent since it tested well with audiences, a request so absurd that Preye laughed out loud for the first time in weeks. She turned all 3 down. Instead, she went home, first to bury a proper stone marker over her grandmother's grave, replacing the softened wooden one, carving beneath Ibitoru's name a single line Preye had chosen herself. She carried the words so that others could finally be heard. Afterward, she stayed on, longer than she had planned, to help organize an independent community fund, using her now very public voice to pressure not just Solandra, but every company drilling along that stretch of river to fund clean water infrastructure directly, transparently, and with community oversight, rather than quiet, informal arrangements made behind closed glass doors. Adaora Kallio, the young legal officer whose forwarded email had first cracked the truth open, resigned from Solandra a month later and joined Preye's small effort as a volunteer, saying only that she had spent enough of her career helping powerful people sound innocent. On the evening the new stone marker was set into the earth, Sokonye stood beside Preye at the water's edge as the sun dropped low and orange over the mangroves, the same light that had greeted her the morning she first came home broken. Your grandmother believed, Sokonye said softly, that the gift was a kind of leash meant to keep a powerful voice small and useful to everyone except its owner. You proved something she never got the chance to prove for herself, that the river's true gift was never obedience, it was truth. And truth does not need permission to speak for itself. Preye stood there a long while, listening to water lapping gently against the stilts of the house she had grown up in, no longer carrying the same oily sheen it had months earlier. And she thought of every classroom, every hallway, every glass-walled room where she had once shrunk her own voice to fit someone else's comfort. She thought of the 4 words that once made an entire boardroom laugh. The community needs closure. And how true they had turned out to be, though not in the way anyone in that room had expected on that first morning.
She never did stop writing for other people entirely. There's, after all, a kind of grace in helping someone else find words for what they cannot say. But she never again let anyone borrow her voice without knowing exactly whose voice it was. And when, months later, a journalist asked her what she wanted people, especially young Nigerians from the creeks, the villages, the emirates, the settlements too small for any map, to take from her story, Preye thought of her grandmother mending nets by lamplight, of black water sliding beneath stilt houses, of laughter in a cold glass room, and she said simply, "They can laugh at how you sound for as long as they want. Just make sure that when you finally speak, you are saying something they cannot afford to ignore." If this story moved you the way it moved everyone who first heard it whispered along that riverbank, don't let it end here. Subscribe for more Nigerian folk tales like this one, stories carried down through rivers and grandmothers and quiet, stubborn courage. Because somewhere, right now, another voice is being underestimated, and its story is only just beginning.